First, let's cover the basics. When our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they made a point to ensure there would be a balance of powers. The 13 colonies had just won their independence from Britain, and the last thing they had wanted was to have another monarch like King George III. The way the government was split up 244 years ago, and the way our government still functions today, goes a little something like this. There are 3 federal branches of government. The executive branch, which houses the president and his or her cabinet members, the legislative branch, which includes the House of Representatives, also known as Congress, and the Senate, and the judicial branch, which is comprised of the Supreme Court. Each branch has a series of checks and balances over the other 2 branches to ensure that neither branch abuses its power. For example, the legislative branch enacts the laws of our country, while the executive branch, specifically the president, has the power to veto those laws before they are officially passed. And the judicial branch has the power to deem those laws unconstitutional. With all of that in mind, let's see what role our government, as well as the Constitution, plays in a current controversy, the USPS and its effect on the 2020 presidential election. First, some background information. COVID-19 just so happened to sweep across the nation at the beginning of election season. As the presidential election approaches and the pandemic continues to pose a threat to the U.S., it has become clear that some new regulations must be put in place when it comes to how elections will be held this year. In order to understand how changes are being made to the election, we must first understand who controls voting logistics in the United States. According to Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. This is the Elections Clause, a clause that delegates concurrent powers shared by both Congress and the states. Essentially, this means that while Congress is given the final say, individual state governments are each given the power to decide how, when, and where their voting is held. Here are just a few examples of how state governments have chosen to handle the elections this year, given the coronavirus. Around 21% of states, including California and Washington, have chosen to respond with universal mail-in voting. Essentially, this means that the government will send a ballot to every registered voter in their state. Meanwhile, 57% of states, including Iowa and Ohio, have come up with a similar solution: absentee voting by application. Basically, this means that anyone from these states can have their ballot sent into them if they apply for one ahead of time. However, the remaining 22% of states, including Texas and Mississippi, have required that individuals can only apply for an absentee ballot if they list a proper excuse for doing so. A few examples of a proper excuse include an absence from the country on election day, a physical disability, or a role as a caregiver that confines the individual to their home. In general, though, these states will not consider fear of catching coronavirus as a valid reason to be sent an absentee ballot. Something important to note, though, is that with over 78% of states using some form of mail-in or absentee voting this year, many are going to be heavily relying on the USPS during the presidential election. With this lies the main controversy. Back in May of this year, Louis DeJoy, a man with no prior experience in the mail industry, was appointed as Postmaster General by the USPS Board of Governors and Donald Trump. Shortly after assuming his role in office, DeJoy began making major cuts to overtime delivery and delivery tips. This significantly slowed the USPS delivery rates as a whole, meaning that many mail-in votes may not arrive in time to be properly counted in the election. In addition to this, DeJoy is also responsible for the defunding and removal of countless machines meant to process the ballots of mail-in voters. Trump has come to DeJoy's defense, stating that mail-in voting itself is too expensive to properly enact nationwide. Additionally, Trump believes that an excess of mail-in voting will lead to voter fraud. A common example of voter fraud is when multiple absentee ballots are filled out by a single voter through forgery of another person's signature. DeJoy has also justified the payment cuts and defunding of mail-in voting machines with the fact that the USPS is currently in debt. The question here is, Are these changes constitutional? Legally speaking, can DeJoy and Trump do this? Again, we must look at the Constitution. According to Article 1, Section 8, Congress is granted the power to establish post offices and post roads. Essentially, this means the legislative branch is granted ultimate authority over the USPS. So while yes, DeJoy is the Postmaster General, Congress is his boss. And, as we learned earlier from the Elections Clause, while states can individually determine how elections are run, Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations. This means that Congress is given ultimate authority over how elections are run. In general, Congress should be the one calling the shots on how everything is run surrounding the presidential election this year. Neither Trump or DeJoy are a part of the legislative branch, but the executive. Despite this, their actions within the USPS will clearly have a major effect on the votes for the upcoming presidential election. As was stated in a recent New York Times article, and as we kind of stated earlier, the main thing all of DeJoy and Trump's actions will do is slow down the delivery rates within the USPS. With Democratic states relying so heavily on mail-in votes this year, this ultimately may mean that less Democratic votes will be counted due to late ballot arrival times. Therefore, Trump and DeJoy's actions are completely unconstitutional, as they tamper with election-related regulations, which, according to the Constitution, is not within their power to decide. The main solution we think state governments should take in regards to the USPS is something similar to Pennsylvania, who is currently attempting to change their laws so that even ballots that arrive after Election Day can still qualify. This approach is clearly justified in the Constitution, because, again, according to Article 1, Section 4, the Elections Clause, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. The key word here is times. States are each given the individual choice to determine the time frame of when elections are held, and therefore should be able to extend the deadline in which absentee ballots are accepted. Of course, if other states attempt to adopt and enforce this law like Pennsylvania did, it must also be approved by Congress, as it is both a new law and it relates to elections. If approved, this would ultimately make Trump and DeJoy's changes in the USPS have little to no effect on the election.